You're listening to episode 244 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Ethan Nichtern joins us to speak about his recent book, The Road Home, a contemporary exploration of the Buddhist path. Hi everyone. Before we get started with today's episode, I want to remind the listeners that we've started a new podcast which may also interest you. It's called Present Moment, Mindfulness Practice and Science, and appears every other week, alternating with The Secular Buddhist. You'll find many of the same guests you've enjoyed and learned from here, as well as new researchers, teachers, and practitioners. You'll find Present Moment in the Science and Medicine section of iTunes, in Natural Sciences, or just do an iTunes store search for mindfulness and look in the results in the podcast section. You can also visit the website, presentmomentmindfulness.com. Thanks for checking it out. And if you like what you hear, please feel free to share it with others. What does the Buddhist path mean to you if you're a contemporary Westerner? And how might that be a little different from other traditional forms? As Buddhism's seeds take root and sprout in the new environment of this culture, it might look a little different, but can still be helpful to transform how we live as individuals and as an increasingly global society. Ethan Nichtern is a senior teacher in the Shambhala tradition and the author of One City, a Declaration of Interdependence. He is also the founder of the Interdependence Project, a nonprofit organization dedicated to secular Buddhist study as it applies to transformational activism, mindful arts and media projects, and Western psychology. Ethan has taught meditation and Buddhist studies classes and retreats in the United States since 2002. He is based in New York City. So sit back, relax, and have a nice raspberry sweet tea. Our guest today is Ethan Nichtern. Ethan, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks. You just reminded me it's been about four or more years. So great to be back with the Secular Buddhists.
Time flies very fast, and maybe that's something that we can catch up on a little bit. What have you been doing in the past several years?
Well, let's see. I'm obviously a huge fan of your notion of secular Buddhism. So I have a title as Shastri, which is a senior teacher position in the Shambhala tradition, which is a tradition that's really dedicated to applying, what once were just Tibetan Buddhist principles to a kind of secular, engaged, awake in the world approach. So I am based in New York City, but travel and teach in a lot of different Shambhala centers around the world. Still involved on the board and lead the teacher training program at the Interdependence Project, which has a whole program in secular Buddhist studies, mindfulness, and the application of Buddhism to a lot of fields of inquiry, activism, Western psychology, arts, media, etc. And, the big thing this year is that my new book, which is an overview Buddhist book, The Road Home, a contemporary exploration of the Buddhist path, came out in April in North America. I think it just came out in Germany, which is the more important thing, just recently in December. And I've been traveling around a lot talking about that book and sort of looking at Buddhist teachings, the mindfulness movement, and sort of trying to frame this whole path of awakening in very contemporary and hopefully accessible context. And, other than that, let's see, I'm getting married next year.
Congratulations. I saw that.
Some of my friends and family think has taken too long. So I'm going to talk about relationships in my next book, which I'm also going to talk about The Princess Bride. So I'm working on that. And like you, I'm looking forward to seeing Star Wars Episode 7, I am a little disappointed, though, that Adam Driver is playing the new Darth Vader, Kylo Ren, and I'm just a little disappointed that Lena Dunham from Girls doesn't play his girlfriend. But other than that, I'm really looking forward to it. So that's what I've been up to.
So practically nothing at all. Practically nothing at all. And congratulations on your engagement as someone who was recently married a little over a year ago. It's awesome. You'll love it.
Congratulations.
Thanks. So let's talk about a little bit about some of the things that you mentioned. I'll be interested in talking with you a bit about that exploration of the mindfulness movement and traditional Buddhism, because that's also a realm that I am in with the secular Buddhist and with the Present Moment Mindfulness podcast as well. Let's talk for just a minute about the secular Buddhist studies program at the ID Project. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I think the listeners might be interested.
Sure. Yeah, it's, I think the best way to talk about it is that it's, it approaches Buddhism from the standpoint of multiple lineages. So we have a few different teachers in the Shambhala community, different Tibetan lineage teachers. I run the teacher training program with my dear friend Kate Johnson, who's a great young teacher in the Insight community. So that I don't know of too many examples of a meditation and Buddhism teacher training program that are taught by teachers who hold different Buddhist traditions. And then, I think the secular part, as I'm sure you get this all the time, some people think that's, redundant. Some people think that's oxymoronic. The standpoint of my tradition is there never really was a separation between secular and spiritual. I'm personally much more interested when a teacher talks about Buddhist principles from a psychological and worldly engaged perspective. But I think that the focus of our Buddhist studies is how to make the Buddhist teachings relevant to the 21st century and also how to approach them from the standpoint of not just one lineage. I think that's a real question about what's going on in the mindfulness and insofar as the mindfulness movement is supported by the Buddhist movement, which I think it would be somewhat disrespectful to the Dharma to say that it wasn't. I mean, there's non-Buddhist forms of meditation, but mindfulness actually is a Buddhist term when you get back to where it's coming from. Yeah, so it's really wonderful, and I think it's an important time because I think the notion of lineage in Buddhism, the notion of lineage, in other words, like that we didn't make this up, but we are applying these teachings to a new life situation, a new cultural and social situation, is incredibly important. But I also think it's a time when the classic notions of lineage, many of which were defined just by technological constrictions and geographical constrictions. If you were in Southeast Asia back in the day, or if you were in Tibet, or Japan back in the day, you studied the kind of Dharma you studied because that's all there was. It's not because that's what you chose. And so now that we have all of these amazing technologies and we have all of these geographic blendings, there's so many different spaces just in New York City, which has become kind of a mecca for Buddhism in the West, which is a very strange thing to say. There's just so much blending and cross-pollination that I think we're in a really interesting era in terms of the next 30 years, like what a Buddhist lineage is even going to look like, if there is going to be such a strong division between Theravada and, Tantric Buddhism, for example.
Yeah, I think you bring up so many rich and wonderful points. Thank you for that. First is this idea that a secular approach is not antagonistic to the tradition at all. Most of us who would declare ourselves as secular Buddhists, for want of a better term for that identification, come from a tradition. We love it. That's part of it. But we also recognize that We are not from India of 2,500 years ago. We're contemporary Westerners, and Buddhism is going through some growing pains as it finds this new, rich, fertile soil. So when people like me and you and others use it, we mean it in a very big tent way. We mean it very inclusively. We mean it as, how does this affect your life today? And how can we make that grow?
It's interesting to see who gets upset with the notion of Buddhism as secular too, because I think there's two groups of people there tend to be in my conversations. One that I think has a very valid claim, which is the understanding, and I talked about this in the road home with sort of thinking about where the spiritual versus secular, religious versus worldly placement of Buddhism could be or is. One group is definitely to acknowledge that culturally, as Buddhism evolved in Asia, it did occupy a more religious, less psychological healing, less path to awakening from a sort of secular psychological point of view space in people's minds. So if you don't at least give credit and honor and acknowledge the fact that in Asia, still to this day, in many, many people's lives, their notion of Buddhism is a really important and holy religious and spiritual space, that could be a form of cultural co-optation, and especially by a mostly privileged white audience to an Asian audience. It could be a form of like, okay, we'll take that and make it better. At the same time, when you look at actually what the master Buddhist teachers, including Siddhartha, said, it is so psychological. It is such a path that resonates with somebody who's really more not coming from one Judeo-Christian spiritual tradition, or not, at least not bound entirely by those. So, but I do think that we really need to be careful and honor the fact that in so many people's lives, when they say Buddhism, they do mean a sort of more religious thing, and that is valuable to them, and that's wonderful. The other group, though, is I think the kind of first generation of people holding the Dharma in the West, because it was acknowledged as a religion, because people didn't really know where to categorize it. Most of the universities where this got held, and most of the sort of academic institutions and systemic institutions that held the Dharma from the 1960s or so, or even before the 1960s to, really just 10 or 15 years ago, it was the religious studies departments of universities, or kind of cross-religion, different entities. And so anytime something becomes systematized in a kind of academic way, then there builds a defense mechanism. You have to defend, what it is. So if you're studying Buddhism at, a top Western university, and you're studying it through the religious studies department, and somebody else comes in and says, well, I think all these things are more useful in the neuroscience, psychology, or even sociology, departments, or even the art department, which Chogyam Trungpa would have agreed with, that there's a threat there, So I think that's part of this, is this notion of there being these centers popping up where the application of Buddhism is more secular, more psychological, is a threat to certain academic establishments in the West. And that part, I feel a little more like I want to get in there and debate that, So somebody said, who I have a friend who's at one of these academic institutions, and on Twitter we got into a little debate, because this person said, Buddhism, I hate when Buddhism is presented as a psychology, right? And if you just look up psychology, it means study of the mind, Anybody who's telling you Buddhism is not a study of the mind, I don't know what they're talking.
Mind-led are they? Dhammapada.
So, it's always to be respectful, but I also think there's nothing really that revolutionary about secular Buddhism. The other thing about secular Buddhism that we have to look at is secular Buddhism is coming from a dualistic framing of secular versus spiritual, which arose in the Western world out of the Age of Enlightenment. And that framing is very historically contextualized. And it's not necessarily a good framing that some things in life are spiritual and other things are secular. There was a reason for it in the Age of Enlightenment, which was to allow the scientific method to grow in an atmosphere where only blind faith was allowed. But it's not necessarily good or helpful to separate things into spiritual or secular truth. We're only really living one life. So that's another thing that I take on in the road home is sort of like, why have we even separated secular from spiritual? Why can't the holy be the mundane? Why can't science be our spirituality, especially if science becomes subjective and inclusive of one's own personal experience?
Yeah, and you bring up a very valid point that there is this, I would suggest, false dichotomy in all definitions of secular. One definition of secular is it is set up as in opposition to the sacred. Totally get that. That's part and parcel. But several other meanings of the word I don't find to be in conflict. And that when someone describes to me, I'll ask, what do you mean by the sacred or spiritual? And they'll talk about, and I insist, you got to use your own words here. Don't quote something. Use your own words. What does this mean to you? And they'll talk about what's deeply transformative and meaningful to them and what moves them. Like, that's exactly what I mean by secular. These may not be as far apart as you think. It's interesting. You also mentioned this idea of how there are different groups who have some challenges with secular Buddhism as a concept. And I'd offer one more that I'd say the group I run into most as being antagonistic to the idea of the secular approach. And that is those who have left some other spiritual tradition, something that perhaps they were harmed by, and have become devotees. They've adopted Buddhism. And there is a very strong aggression to anything other than this particular interpretation of the Dhamma, whatever that may be. And I always ask, well, which Buddhism do you mean? Is it this one? Is it that one? What is the perfect Dharma that you're talking about? Because that may be not such a useful concept for us. So what's our starting point for the discussion? And that provides a little bit of a challenge, because it usually means they have to point out another kind of very valid Buddhism for millions of people in the world is wrong. And they're not so willing to do that. And it also brings up that, maybe what's right for you, which is great, as you're saying, Ethan, that's a terrific thing. We're not trying to take away from that at all. We honor and respect that. But here's something that is more consonant and in alignment with our lives, with our upbringing, with our background. Why is that a bad thing? Right. And so we'll get into that a little bit. So I think there's a replacement of spiritual practice infrastructure, if you will, with something else that has equally not been questioned like the original one was. Right. And so there's some ownership of that. And I think, as you say, with the academic world, a little bit of defensiveness on this. Like, I've adopted this, and there's an identification with it, a selfing. And I think that's where the challenge comes.
I have a PhD in religious studies in Buddhism, and therefore I must defend, that role. Right, which is interesting because I have a senior teacher title, which is kind of a form of PhD from the lineage, and I really feel like I need to defend whatever I can do to awaken and help others awaken, and I think that's the other thing. In the road home, I did this very simple translation thing where I translated Buddhist, which is a half-translated word. It's an interesting word because the first half of the word is either Sanskrit or Pali language, the ancient languages of Buddhism, and the second half of the word is English. So it's a weird word to begin with.
Even the concept itself didn't come up until the past couple of hundred years from Westerners.
Right. So if we fully at least translate the word, you come to the word awakest, and all of a sudden that sort of clarifies, like, this is the path of someone who is trying to awaken to their own reality and their interdependence with others. So I think that makes it a lot more accessible and kind of clarifies, oh yeah. And, I work with a ton of people in this growing Generation X, millennial pool, the fastest moving segment of our society right now is people, when asked what their religious affiliation is, they say none. And so I think there's also within the mindfulness movement and within the experience of Buddhism, there's a large group within there that says, if I'm anything, I'm a Buddhist. And if I'm anything, I'm an Awakeist. And then the question is like, so then why aren't you? Because there's some obstacle or some inaccessibility still. So, I think it's interesting. You always have the defenders of whatever they're trying to defend, and I think it really is up to us teachers to make sure that the sort of practices and ethics and kindness and consideration of the Dharma don't go away. But, a lot of it is just language and semantics. And it's always so interesting to me when you see somebody defending their semantics so hard. And then you're like, but what if you put it this way? And they're like, well, that's not wrong. And it's like, well, that's not right. Well, it's like, but that's just a translation, So that's why I like in the road home translating Buddhist as Awakeist, because it feels like it comes back to some kind of heart about what this is all about. And I don't think we need in the 21st century more spiritual people. I think we need more mindful and compassionate people, and that's what I'm longing and striving to become. And that does feel like what at the end of the day really inspires people is not the identification, but the actual path to sort of embracing our awakened humanity.
Right. That's what we do, not what we identify as, that makes the difference. So you've had some recognition for the book. I want to ask about what's happened with that recently and then go into what prompted you to write this particular one.
Yeah. So the Road Home have a great publisher, great editors, Farrar, Straus and Giroux here in New York. It came out in April in hardcover, and I was really traveling around a lot in April, May, and June, and a bit over the summer, and talking to people about it. And people really seem to resonate with this notion of one's own heart or mind as home. And, there's a lot to that metaphor that's kind of drawn out in the book. But it started getting really good responses from people reading it. And then let's see what happened. Library Journal, a big literary publication, named it to the best books of the year, which was a surprise because I don't think a lot of sort of Buddhist books
they don't make it into that.
Which was, that was sweet. And I've always been a writer, so or always identified. I identify more hardcore as a writer than I do as one or another type of Buddhist. I defend that identity. But yeah, that was great recognition. And then a big website called Tech Insider just named it to, not I think it was 9 books that define 2015, which was pretty cool because the other books on that list were like the Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me, like the really amazing books that I read this year. So it was pretty amazing to be included in that list. So as I wrote a book that came out in 2007 called One City, which was really about interdependence and sort of viewing the Buddhist teachings as a framework for seeing our life in global society, especially in a city or urban existence, as a kind of lens to see how interdependent everything is. And then I think maybe 3 years ago, I had been teaching for 10 or 11 years. And, I felt like I had kind of accumulated a sense, especially a sense of the overview of what the Buddhist path looks like from the Shambhala tradition, and a sense of what were the topics that really inspired people? Also, what were the questions that really confused people? Like questions like, what are the different types of meditation to begin with? Questions like, what is karma? And is this just some new like roulette wheel from the universe? Or how does that actually work from a psychological perspective? Questions like, what is visualization practice? And why would somebody do that? So talked about a bunch of Buddhists going to the movie theater together in that chapter as a way to explain. Yeah, but so it was sort of like addressing, so I've been teaching in a wide variety of arenas, since 2001 or 2002, and like what's a way to structure the teachings of contemporary Buddhism, especially from the Shambhala standpoint, that really addresses some of the inspirations and confusions that people have. But I also, I'm really a student of narrative, and I think we both want to see The Force Awakens. I thought you would have already seen it by the time we talked. So
I was hoping to have seen it by the time we talked.
Which is good, because we get to talk about this now, and we would have just been talking about that on air. But, I've always been really intrigued from the sort of narrative standpoint of how Buddhism has so many stories, analogies, metaphors for being on a path, on a journey, on a quest, on the road somewhere. The whole thing is called the path, and obviously Buddhism covers all aspects of life and philosophy and ethical behavior. But for the most part, a person stills their body to contemplate and work with their heart and mind. So it's interesting that the whole thing is called the path, So I was really interested in that ironic metaphor that's throughout Buddhist history, and also just so interested in all of the narratives throughout human history that are about a journey, a path, a quest, from the Odyssey to Battlestar Galactica to On the Road. It's just such a core human narrative. And it also, in Buddhism, not just the path to awakening is described as a journey, but also sort of our confused state is defined as a much more murky or confused or redundant path, So samsara, the word for all of our kind of states of confusion and destructive behavior, literally means something like wandering around in circles when you combine the Pali, Sanskrit, and Tibetan words. So wandering around in circles. The Tibetan word for a confused sentient being, drowa, literally means something like always on the go. So I was thinking about, what is a 2015, 2016, depending on when people are listening to this, analogy that we can all relate to wherever we are for this notion of a life wandering around in circles, always being on the go. And I thought of the word commuter, that we're just kind of lost in commute, sort of looking for the next thing. Commute's such an interesting space because for most of us, not for everyone, it's a space that's defined as, I wish I was somewhere else. It's in between, and it doesn't have value, and it has a lot of discomfort. And there's a feeling of belonging elsewhere, trying to get elsewhere. And so more than even daily commute, I was really thinking of what does it look like when you spend a whole life in commute, trying to get to the next experience, I remember very vividly, being in elementary and junior high school and listening to older kids talking about high school as when you've arrived. And that's obviously not true. And then it's okay, when we graduate college, that's when we get to be in the real world. And it just, it goes on. And then it's maybe when I settle down, or it's maybe when I go travel, maybe it's when I go see the world, or there's just this sense. I have a lot of friends on the path who are, the path takes a lot of time and to practice and study and do retreats and things like that. And their narrative of the commute is, I'm so busy right now, but when I retire, then it will be fine, So it's just this sense of where are we trying to get? I think the sort of human narrative is we're actually always trying to get home, and it's really wonderful, I think, to think of home, safe home, and wish a safe home for every sentient being. I think of all the refugees on earth, Syrian refugees, etc. A Buddhist should be wishing that people have a safe home, because where we're really trying to get is to a space where our own heart and mind feels like home, and that to me is what the Buddhist path is saying, how do I actually turn my own emotional, perceptual, intellectual, experiencing, loving, fearing, doubtful, anxious, nervous, insightful, wonderful apparatus? How do I turn the space of my basic humanity into a safe home in which experiences can arise? And then the journey through life, you feel like you belong a lot more. And so that's the kind of core emotional narrative that weaves throughout the sort of more overview of different topics from the Buddhist tradition. And I try to quote from a lot of different areas. I try to quote, teachers from my own Shambhala lineage, teachers from other Buddhist lineages that I've studied a fair amount in, try to quote Western psychologists. I'm very much interested in the crossover Western psychotherapists or Western psychological thinkers. I'm very interested in the crossover between those spaces of inquiry. There's a couple of Bill Murray movies make their entrance into the narrative. I think I mentioned lineage as the Jedis in the forest from Return of the Jedi. I hope The Force Awakens still has the ghostly Jedis.
I'm hoping.
I miss Liam Neeson. He was like the best thing. And
I do. I'm hoping that there may be one in the works now, is one of the books, because I've also been a reader of the books. And for those of you who are listening, we're going to diverge because we're
so Ted, it might be like a brand confusion, but you should really name your podcast Secular Buddhist Geeks.
I'll talk to Vince about that and see how he feels. But I really want to see a book on Qui-Gon Jinn, because of all the Jedi, they had one on a recent book on Ben Kenobi, which was awesome. I love it. I thought they did a great job on it. And it really goes to what was this person's experience like, hiding out, watching the child of someone who was his dearest, closest friend who betrayed. So there's rich human experience in that. And I want to see that with Qui-Gon Jinn. I want to get a little bit into that too. But we digress. So one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, in the book, you talk a bit about spiritual materialism and the risk with that. Let's dive into that a little bit.
Yeah. So this was kind of one of the kind of core seminal books that Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, the founder of my tradition, wrote when he came to North America, was Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism. And I would say that the way that I talk about reinterpreting this notion of materialism, which is, there's a really beautiful classic Buddhist philosophical critique against a materialistic view of the universe, which is a little too nerdy to go into, but it's partially coming out of that. But he felt that the particular application of the false view of materialism was to our spiritual practice itself. And so in this narrative of home, or the road home, or trying to stop this sort of anxious, confused commute through experiences looking for something else, one way to look at materialism is materialism has to do with turning home into an object that is outside one's own grasp or outside one's separate. Yeah, it's over there. It's the object of consciousness rather than the mind being home itself. And so we could think about the ways that we objectify home in terms of the actual object world. Anytime Apple, which I use their products, but anytime they announce a new product, it's like a spiritual convention, and the people in the audience, obviously, who mostly probably have stock options, but the people in the audience really seem to believe that the iPhone 7, when it comes out, is going to make them belong. That's going to solve the problem. It's going to make life perfect. So that's kind of an obvious outer level of materialism, right? And everybody who's ever bought an iPhone, there's no iPhone that's not going to die, right? So obviously there's some false view of reality in this notion that this is really going to do it for me permanently. Trungpa Rinpoche also talked about how we do this an intellectual pursuit. We turn a kind of ideology or an intellectual identity, like I'm a progressive, or I'm a conservative, or I'm a foodie, or, I'm a atheist, or I'm a Buddhist. We can turn that sort of an intellectual identity into home. And he called that, you could say, either ideological materialism, or he talked about it as speech materialism, because it's about how you express yourself to the world. Then spiritual materialism, he talked about, it involves turning the simplest way to say it, which is not exactly the way he said it, but that makes the most sense to me, is when you try to turn states of mind, particularly emotions that you correlate with spiritual experiences, into a kind of home. right? So he talked about pursuing spiritual paths that sort of fortify the ego, right? But it's the way that we look for spiritual paths that always make us feel the emotions that we want to feel and don't cause us to deal with or help us avoid the emotions that we don't want to feel, you know? And we all have our list of the spiritual emotions, like bliss, like love, like, you know, fulfillment, like happiness. And we all have that list of emotions that, like awkwardness, insecurity, fear, anger, jealousy, sadness, especially sadness, that we want to say, like, if I go into a spiritual experience, if I study with a spiritual teacher, if I go to a sangha or community and I feel sadness, it's bad news. Take me back to the bliss experience, you know, take me back to that, euphoric Kundalini moment, that Burning Man moment, you know, and it's wonderful to have those moments, you know, those moments are part of life and part of the spiritual practice, but they're just moments. They arise in home, you know. So I think of spiritual materialism as a kind of emotional materialism. It's when we pursue only the states of mind that we associate in a sort of materialistic way with being a spiritual being. And therefore we end up rejecting most of what happens to us because
right. We're avoiding the hard stuff and the
right.
hard work, which is perhaps the source of our greatest growing when we actually work with that.
Yeah. I mean, there is no more spiritual emotion than sadness. Or fear. I can tell you that from the personal experience. A human being who has made a good, friendly, loving relationship with their own sadness, who provides space for it in the home of their mind, that's going to be an incredibly powerful human being. And a human being who's trying to pretend that they've transcended sadness is going to be living in some kind of cognitive dissonance. I feel really clear on that. The more I embrace my difficult emotions with love and use my meditation practice as a way to actually, as I say in the book, updating a phrase from the Shambhala teachings, use my meditation practice to accept my own friend request, for the Facebook generation. The more I'm able to do that, the more awake and compassionate I feel in my own life. So that's the way I think of spiritual materialism, is it's only pursuing spiritual paths that make us feel a certain way. And I think for me, the path of Dharma tells me we need to actually learn how to be present with every single arising feeling, every single arising perception slowly, you know, because some might be, especially if you have trauma or abuse in your background, obviously some are going to be too intense to handle. But the path is towards actually making friends with what arises in the home of your heart and mind, not pretending it doesn't exist or wishing it away.
Yeah, and expecting that path is going to be straight and level and clear of all debris. Not necessarily so. Life isn't like that.
Right.
Ethan, what else would you like to share with the audience before we let you go?
I'm so happy that this, you know, podcast community exists. It's really awesome that I'm more in the category of thinking that the secular Buddhist is a redundant title. But yeah, ethannichtern.com is my personal website, and there's lots of updates and podcasts and articles, and you can get information on the road home there. And yeah, my next book is The Dharma of the Princess Bride. So I'm hoping I'm going to pull off a nice genre bending, you know, 1/3 Dharma book on relationships, 1/3 kind of memoir, and 1/3 homage to pop culture as our spiritual text, as something that can actually, we can learn spiritual lessons from. So, I hope maybe we can, when that book is out in 2017, maybe we can, chat over that one. I don't know if you're a Princess Bride fan, but.
My name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die. Yes.
Okay. You and Senator Ted Cruz both love Princess Bride, so that should dissolve all dualistic barriers for God.
Oh, that just hurt. Yeah, certainly I do want to have you back for that. And when I saw you posted about that coming like that, it's an awesome subject to go into for the Dharma. So thank you for working on that. Eager to have you back. And for folks who are listening, I will be linking to ethannichtern.com, as well as having links to both of the books that we've talked about today that are currently published: The Road Home, A Contemporary Exploration of the Buddhist Path, as well as One City, A Declaration of Interdependence. Ethan, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Ted.
thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.